I'm Maya Castellanos, 33 years old, and for the past 11 years I've been raising children that aren't mine. When my brother Derek called last Tuesday to announce that his girlfriend Simone was pregnant with their 5th child, something inside me finally snapped. He expected congratulations, maybe offers to babysit like always, but instead I told him something that made his voice go cold. I'm done, Derek. Figure it out yourself this time. Let me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button to hear how my decision to finally set boundaries led to revelations that changed everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Castellanos family has always operated on a specific set of unspoken rules, and the most fundamental one was this: family takes care of family, no matter what. My parents, Rosa and Miguel Castellanos, immigrated from Guatemala in their early 20s with nothing but determination and the dream of building something substantial in America. They settled in Riverside, a sprawling suburb outside Los Angeles where the housing was affordable and opportunities existed for those willing to work multiple jobs. Dad started as a landscaper and eventually built Castellanos Landscaping Services, a company that employed 15 people and serviced some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Southern California. Mom worked as a housekeeper for the first 10 years. Then as Dad's business grew, she transitioned to managing the company's administrative operations from our home office. Success came through sacrifice, and my parents never let us forget it. Every conversation about grades, career choices, or life decisions circled back to the same themes: the importance of family loyalty, the necessity of working harder than everyone else, and the obligation to help family members who struggled. These weren't just abstract values discussed around the dinner table. They were lived principles that shaped every aspect of our household dynamics. When my uncle lost his construction job during the recession, he lived in our garage apartment for 2 years rent-free. When my cousin needed help paying for community college, my parents covered her tuition without hesitation. The Castellanos family was a unit, and individual needs were always subordinate to collective responsibility. Derek was born 3 years before me, and from the beginning, he occupied a special position in our family hierarchy. As the firstborn son in a traditional household, he carried expectations and privileges that I never experienced. Dad took him to job sites starting when Derek was barely tall enough to reach the truck bed, teaching him about native plants, irrigation systems, and the business of maintaining the properties of wealthy clients who barely noticed the workers who kept their estates pristine. Mom doted on him with an intensity that felt almost protective, constantly making excuses when he failed to meet deadlines for school projects, arrived home past curfew, or displayed the kind of irresponsible behavior that would have resulted in serious consequences if I had been the culprit. The differential treatment became more pronounced as we entered our teenage years. Derek was charismatic in the way that allows certain people to glide through life without facing the full consequences of their choices. He was handsome with an easy smile, and the kind of confident charm that made people want to believe his promises even when his track record suggested skepticism would be wiser. Teachers forgave late assignments, friends overlooked borrowed money that was never repaid, and our parents interpreted every failure as a temporary setback, rather than a pattern that required serious intervention. Meanwhile, I was held to rigorous standards that left no room for mistakes. My grades needed to be exceptional because I was pursuing a college education that my parents had never experienced. My behavior needed to be beyond reproach because as a young woman, I represented the family's reputation in ways that Derek apparently did not. My career choices needed to demonstrate both ambition and practicality, proving that their investment in my education would yield returns, while also positioning me to contribute to family obligations when necessary. The divergent expectations created resentment that I learned to suppress, because expressing it would have been interpreted as selfishness and ingratitude. I watched Derek receive a new truck for his 18th birthday purchased with company funds, while I was told that my college savings could cover a used sedan if I contributed money from my part-time job at the library. I observed how his decision to skip college and work sporadically for Dad's company was framed as him learning the business, while my announcement that I wanted to major in social work, rather than business administration, was met with weeks of tense conversations about wasting opportunities and impractical idealism. The message was clear even when never explicitly stated. Derek's potential was limitless and deserving of patient investment, while my path needed to demonstrate immediate practical value and position me to serve family needs. My relationship with Derek during those years was complicated by genuine affection that coexisted with growing frustration. He could be thoughtful in unexpected moments, remembering my favorite candy when he stopped at the convenience store, or defending me against a boyfriend who had treated me poorly. But those moments of connection were increasingly overshadowed by a pattern of behavior that revealed his fundamental self-centeredness. He borrowed money that was never repaid, made commitments he failed to honor, and operated with an assumption that other people would always be available to manage the consequences of his choices. He moved through life as though he were the protagonist in a story where other characters existed primarily to support his journey, and our parents' unconditional acceptance of this worldview reinforced his belief that such treatment was his natural due. The real transformation in our family dynamics began when Derek was 23 and I was 20. He had been dating a woman named Jennifer for approximately 6 months when she became pregnant with their first child. The pregnancy was unplanned, and Derek's initial response was panic followed by vague assurances that he would handle the responsibility. Jennifer was young, 21 years old, working as a receptionist at a dental office and still living with roommates in a cramped apartment in a neighborhood where car break-ins were routine and gunshots occasionally punctuated the night. She came from a difficult background involving foster care and unstable housing, and the prospect of raising a child seemed to activate every protective instinct in my mother's considerable repertoire of caretaking behaviors. Mom immediately began making arrangements, clearing out the spare bedroom that had served as her sewing room and transforming it into a nursery. She accompanied Jennifer to every prenatal appointment when Derek claimed work obligations prevented him from attending. She purchased baby furniture, clothing, diapers, and all the equipment that new parents require, never asking Derek to contribute financially even though he was supposedly earning money working for Dad's company. The implicit message was that Jennifer and the baby needed support, and the Castellanos family would provide it because that was what families did. My role in these arrangements was never explicitly negotiated, but rather assumed based on proximity and availability. I was living at home while attending the local state university, commuting to classes and working part-time to cover my personal expenses and contribute to my education costs that exceeded what my parents could comfortably provide. My presence in the house meant I was available to help, and help quickly became an expectation rather than an occasional request. When Aiden was born on a rainy November evening, I was 20 years old and in the middle of finals week for my junior year. I had 3 major exams and a research paper due within 5 days, but the crisis of Derek and Jennifer's new parenthood took precedence over my academic obligations. Jennifer stayed with us for the first 6 weeks after the birth, recovering in the spare bedroom while Mom and I managed the overwhelming demands of a newborn. Derek continued living in his apartment across town, visiting periodically but always finding reasons why he couldn't stay overnight when Aiden was fussy or needed nighttime feedings. He had work in the morning, he explained, and someone needed to maintain employment to provide for his new family. The logic was superficially reasonable but failed to account for the fact that his work for Dad's company was flexible, and frequently involved him disappearing for hours without clear explanation of how he was spending his time. I found myself waking every 3 hours through the night, because Jennifer was exhausted and Mom needed sleep to function during the day managing the business operations. I learned to change diapers, prepare bottles, and soothe a crying infant while my textbooks lay unopened on my desk. I negotiated with my professors for extensions on assignments, explaining family emergencies in vague terms that didn't quite capture the reality that the emergency was actually my brother's refusal to fully engage with the consequences of his choices. I watched my grade point average drop that semester from a consistent high level to merely adequate, and I felt the first stirrings of real anger toward Derek for his ability to create chaos that other people were expected to manage. The pattern that began with Aiden's birth became the template for everything that followed. Jennifer and Derek's relationship was volatile, characterized by passionate reconciliations and dramatic separations. They would break up amid accusations and recriminations. Jennifer would move out with Aiden to stay with a friend or temporary boyfriend, and Derek would appear wounded and regretful, promising Mom that he was going to step up and be the father Aiden deserved. These promises always proved temporary. Within weeks or months, Derek would meet someone new, and the cycle would repeat. Jennifer would eventually reconcile with Derek, or he would move on to another relationship, But Aiden remained a constant presence in our household regardless of the current status of his parents' romantic situation. By the time I graduated from college with my bachelor's degree in social work, I had essentially been co-parenting Aiden for 3 years. I knew his favorite foods, his bedtime routine, the specific way he needed his stuffed rabbit position before he could fall asleep. I had attended his first day of preschool because Derek had a job that day and Jennifer was working. I had stayed up with him through ear infections and stomach viruses, had celebrated his 3rd birthday with a party that I had largely planned and funded from my limited income. I loved him genuinely and completely, which made the situation more complex than simple resentment would have allowed. This child had become central to my life not through any choice I had made, but through a gradual accumulation of obligations that I had accepted, because refusing would have meant abandoning an innocent person who depended on me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second pregnancy occurred when Derek was 25, and involved a woman named Crystal, whom he had been dating for approximately 4 months. Crystal was different from Jennifer in obvious ways, including a more middle-class background and stable employment as a pharmacy technician, but the fundamental pattern remained unchanged. The pregnancy was unplanned. Crystal moved into our house during her 3rd trimester when Derek explained that his apartment was too small for a baby, and I once again found myself managing late-night feedings and diaper changes while Derek maintained his routine of appearing for the pleasant moments and disappearing when things became difficult. Sophia was born when I was 24, and working my first professional job as a case manager for a nonprofit serving foster youth. The position was demanding and emotionally draining, requiring me to manage a caseload of 30 adolescents who were navigating the transition out of the child welfare system. I would spend my days advocating for teenagers who faced housing instability, educational barriers, and trauma histories, then return home to care for an infant and a 4-year-old while Derek pursued whatever activities occupied his evenings. Crystal's relationship with Derek followed a similar trajectory as Jennifer's had, marked by intense connection followed by equally intense conflict. She stayed with us for 8 months after Sophia's birth, then moved out after a particularly volatile argument with Derek about his refusal to commit to their relationship in any formal way. She took Sophia with her initially, but within 6 months, Sophia was spending most nights at our house because Crystal's work schedule made childcare complicated and Derek argued that his daughter should be with family rather than in daycare. The fact that Derek himself was rarely present to care for Sophia was conveniently elided in these discussions. What mattered was that the Castellanos household could provide stability, and I was there to ensure that stability translated into actual care. The 3rd pregnancy involved a woman named Brittany whom Derek had met at a bar, and dated for approximately 2 months before she became pregnant. Brittany was young, 22 to Derek's 27, and working multiple part-time service jobs to support herself. She had no family support system, and was understandably overwhelmed by the prospect of single parenthood. Mom's response was identical to her previous patterns of immediately offering housing and support, and Brittany moved into our home during her 2nd trimester. Marcus was born when I was 26 years old, and by this point, the absurdity of the situation was becoming impossible to ignore even as I continued participating in it. I had 3 children under the age of 6 living in my parents' house, none of whom were mine biologically, and I was providing the majority of their daily care while trying to maintain a demanding career and some semblance of a personal life. My dating life had essentially ceased to exist, because bringing someone home meant introducing them to a household of chaos that required significant explanation. How did I explain that I was raising my brother's children, without making my entire family sound dysfunctional? How did I justify the amount of time and energy I devoted to parenting responsibilities when I had no legal relationship to these children, and no formal agreement about my role? The few relationships I attempted during this period ended when partners realized that I was not exaggerating about my limited availability, and that family obligations genuinely took precedence over romantic plans more often than not. I watched friends from college get married, pursue graduate degrees, travel internationally, and advance in their careers while I remained tethered to Riverside managing responsibilities that had somehow become mine through a process of gradual assumption, rather than conscious choice. The 4th pregnancy occurred when Derek was 29 and involved Simone, a woman he had met through mutual friends. Simone was 31, had never been married, and worked as a medical billing specialist with stable income and benefits. She seemed more mature than Derek's previous partners, and I allowed myself to hope that perhaps this relationship would break the established pattern. Simone was clear from the beginning that she wanted marriage and a committed partnership, not another casual situation. Derek responded to her expectations with what appeared to be genuine effort toward responsibility, and for several months, their relationship seemed more stable than his previous ones had been. When Simone became pregnant, Derek announced it with unusual enthusiasm, claiming that this time would be different because he had finally found the right partner and was ready to build a real family. He moved out of his bachelor apartment and into a rental house with Simone, a 2-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood where they began creating a home together. For approximately 4 months during Simone's pregnancy, Derek was more present and engaged than I had ever seen him. He attended prenatal appointments, helped prepare the nursery, and talked about his plans for being an involved father in ways that suggested he had finally recognized the pattern he had established with his previous children. Isabella was born when I was 29 years old, and initially Derek and Simone seemed to be managing parenthood together in their own home. I allowed myself to believe that perhaps my period of intensive involvement with Derek's children was finally ending, that he had matured enough to take genuine responsibility for his choices. That belief lasted approximately 3 months before the familiar patterns reasserted themselves. Derek began complaining about sleep deprivation and how Simone's expectations were unreasonable. He started spending more time at our parents' house, bringing Isabella with him and leaving her for hours while he supposedly ran errands or handled business obligations. Simone, overwhelmed by the demands of caring for an infant while working full-time and managing a household essentially alone, began calling me for help with increasing frequency. Could I watch Isabella for a few hours so she could sleep? Could I come over and help with the nighttime routine because Derek had gone out with friends? Could I provide advice about breastfeeding problems or sleep schedules, because Derek seemed annoyed when she brought up these concerns? I found myself once again deeply involved in the daily care of Derek's child. Except this time I also felt responsible for supporting Simone, who seemed genuinely committed to making the relationship work despite Derek's increasingly obvious disengagement. I watched history repeat itself with a sense of helplessness that was deepening into something more corrosive. This was not just about Derek's pattern anymore. This was about my pattern, my inability to establish boundaries, my participation in a dynamic that was consuming my life while Derek continued to avoid the consequences of his choices. By the time I turned 30, I was the primary caregiver for 4 children ranging in age from 9 years old to 6 months old. Aiden was in 3rd grade, Sophia was in kindergarten, Marcus was in preschool, and Isabella was an infant requiring constant attention. Derek had maintained minimal relationships with all of their mothers, but was not in committed partnerships with any of them. Jennifer had largely disappeared from Aiden's life after moving to Nevada with a new boyfriend. Crystal had Sophia on weekends occasionally but relied on me to provide most of the actual parenting during the week. Brittany saw Marcus sporadically, her work schedule and unstable housing situation making consistent custody arrangements impossible. Simone was still trying to maintain her relationship with Derek, but the strain was increasingly visible in her exhausted face and short temper. My life had become an endless cycle of school pickups, meal preparation, homework assistance, bedtime routines, and crisis management. I had stopped pursuing professional advancement opportunities because I lacked the time and energy to take on additional responsibilities at work. I had depleted my savings paying for children's expenses that Derek claimed he couldn't afford despite supposedly earning money from Dad's company. I had given up hobbies, friendships, and any sense of personal autonomy because the demands of caring for 4 children, while working full-time, left no space for anything else. I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, a bone-deep weariness that came from years of subordinating my needs to others without any recognition that what I was doing was extraordinary rather than simply expected. The worst part was that everyone treated the situation as normal, as simply how things were in the Castellanos family. Mom praised my dedication and sacrifice but never questioned why Derek was not equally dedicated or sacrificial. Dad occasionally expressed vague frustration with Derek's work ethic, but continued employing him and paying him despite frequent absences and poor performance. Extended family members commented on how wonderful it was that I was so involved with my nieces and nephews, never asking why their father was not similarly involved or acknowledging that my involvement had long since crossed the boundary from supportive aunt to surrogate parent. The situation had become so normalized through gradual accumulation that pointing out its fundamental unfairness felt like challenging a basic law of physics. I had attempted to raise concerns multiple times over the years, but these conversations always followed the same script. I would express frustration about the amount of responsibility I was carrying, and Mom would respond that family takes care of family, and that the children needed stability regardless of Derek's failings. Dad would acknowledge that Derek should be more responsible, but would frame it as a character weakness that required patience and support rather than consequences. Derek himself would become defensive and hurt, accusing me of not caring about his children, and not understanding how hard he was trying despite obstacles I did not appreciate. The conversations would end with me feeling guilty for being selfish and ungrateful, for failing to recognize that my educated privilege and stable employment meant I had an obligation to help family members who struggled more than I did. This was the context when Derek called last Tuesday evening as I was helping Aiden with his math homework while simultaneously preparing dinner and trying to respond to work emails regarding a crisis with one of my clients. His voice on the phone was excited in a way I had learned to associate with announcements that would create more obligations for me. He launched immediately into the news without preamble or consideration for whether this was a convenient time for an extended conversation. Simone was pregnant again, he announced, due in approximately 7 months. It was unexpected, but they were happy about it, and he wanted the family to know so we could all be excited together. He talked about how Isabella would be a big sister, about how this pregnancy felt different because he and Simone were more established now, about his hopes that this baby would be a boy so he would finally have a son with Simone after having one with Brittany. I listened to his monologue while watching Aiden struggle with fractions, while stirring pasta sauce that was beginning to burn, while feeling something crack inside me that had been developing stress fractures for 11 years. When Derek finally paused, presumably expecting congratulations or offers of support, I heard my own voice say words I had not consciously planned. I told him I was done, that I would not be raising this child the way I had raised his previous 4, that he needed to figure out parenthood without relying on me to manage the consequences of his choices. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Aiden asking me a question about denominators that I could not process while my pulse pounded in my ears. Derek's response began with confusion, as though he genuinely did not understand what I was saying. What did I mean I was done? Done with what? I explained in terms that were more blunt than anything I had previously allowed myself to express. I told him that I had been raising his children for over a decade while he avoided the daily work of parenting. I told him that I had sacrificed my career advancement, my relationships, my financial stability, and my personal life to provide care that he should have been providing. I told him that I loved Aiden, Sophia, Marcus, and Isabella, but that my love for them did not obligate me to continue sacrificing everything while he contributed nothing beyond periodic visits and empty promises of future responsibility. I told him that this 5th pregnancy was his and Simone's responsibility to manage without assuming that I would once again step in to provide the actual work of raising the child. Derek's confusion transformed rapidly into anger. He accused me of abandoning his children, of being selfish and jealous of his life, of resenting him for having a family while I remained single. He said that Mom and Dad would be ashamed of my attitude, that family loyalty meant being there when people needed help, that my education and career success had made me think I was better than the rest of the family. His words were designed to activate the guilt that had always been effective in controlling my behavior, and I felt their familiar weight even as I recognized the manipulation underlying them. But beneath the guilt was something newer and stronger, a clarity that came from finally articulating what I had been suppressing for over a decade. I told Derek that the conversation was over, and that my position was not negotiable. I ended the call and sat at the kitchen table while Aiden asked me again about his math homework and the pasta sauce burned beyond salvaging. I felt simultaneously liberated and terrified, as though I had finally jumped from a burning building without knowing whether there was anything to catch my fall. I had just severed an expectation that had defined my adult life, and I had no idea what the consequences would be or whether I possessed the strength to maintain this boundary when the full force of family pressure was inevitably applied. Within 2 hours, my phone began ringing with calls from Mom, from Dad, from Derek again, from Simone herself. I did not answer, instead sending a group text that explained my position in clear terms. I loved my nieces and nephews and would always have relationships with them, but I was no longer available to provide primary care or to serve as the default solution for Derek and his partner's childcare needs. I would be happy to visit as an aunt, to attend school events and birthdays, to maintain connections with children I genuinely cared about, but my role as surrogate parent was ending immediately. Anyone who wanted to discuss this decision could do so, after taking time to consider their own participation in the dynamic that had brought me to this breaking point. The silence that followed was more ominous than any immediate confrontation would have been. I knew that consequences were coming, that my parents would not simply accept this boundary without attempting to change my position. I knew that Derek would marshal every manipulation and guilt tactic available to him, and that I would face intense pressure to reconsider. But for the first time in 11 years, I felt like I was reclaiming something fundamental that I had lost through gradual erosion: the right to define my own life according to my own values and priorities, rather than according to expectations imposed by others. Whatever happened next, I had finally said the word that family dynamics had trained me to believe was forbidden. I had said no. Understanding how I arrived at that breaking point requires understanding the Castellanos family system and the values that shaped every interaction, expectation, and obligation within it. My parents were not malicious people attempting to exploit me or favor Derek through conscious cruelty. They were individuals operating from a cultural framework and survival mentality that made perfect sense within their own experience, but created devastating consequences when applied to circumstances they did not fully recognize as different from their own struggles. My mother Rosa had grown up in rural Guatemala in a family of 8 children where survival required collective effort and individual desires were subordinated to group needs without question. She had left school after 6th grade to help her mother with younger siblings and contribute to household income through whatever work was available. Her migration to the United States at 22 had been an act of desperation following political violence that made remaining in her village increasingly dangerous. She arrived with nothing, knowing minimal English, and survived through a combination of grueling physical labor and reliance on extended family networks that provided housing, job referrals, and the social support necessary to navigate an unfamiliar country. Her entire understanding of how the world functioned was built on the principle that family members pooled resources and supported one another without calculation or resentment, because the alternative was isolation and potential destruction. My father Miguel had a similar background, though his family had been slightly more economically stable. He came from a small city rather than a rural village and had completed high school before economic necessity forced him to begin working full-time. His migration had been motivated by economic opportunity rather than violence, but the challenges he faced were comparable to my mother's experience. He worked construction jobs, landscaping positions, and whatever other labor he could find while sending money back to his parents and siblings who remained in Guatemala. His pathway to business ownership had required 15 years of 7-day work weeks, living in cramped apartments with multiple roommates to minimize expenses, and sacrificing every comfort or pleasure to accumulate the capital necessary to purchase equipment and establish his own company. His identity was completely intertwined with the narrative of self-made success through relentless work ethic and family loyalty. These backgrounds created a worldview where struggle was not only expected but considered character building, where asking for help from family was natural and providing that help was non-negotiable, and where individual ambitions were always framed in terms of how they served collective family interests. My parents genuinely believed they were instilling important values when they emphasized family obligation above personal desires. They saw American individualism as fundamentally selfish and morally inferior to the communal values they had grown up with. When they told stories about their own sacrifices, about working multiple jobs while raising children, about sending money to relatives in Guatemala, even when their own circumstances were precarious, they were not simply reminiscing. They were teaching lessons about what constituted admirable behavior and what constituted shameful selfishness. The complications arose because they applied this framework inconsistently, shaped by gender expectations and birth order dynamics that they never examined critically. Derek, as the firstborn son, occupied a position in their mental hierarchy that exempted him from many of the expectations applied to me. When he struggled, it was interpreted as external circumstances requiring family support. When I struggled, it was interpreted as insufficient effort or poor choices requiring correction. When Derek made decisions that created obligations for others, the focus was on the family's responsibility to manage those obligations. When I made decisions that prioritized my own needs, the focus was on my selfishness and lack of family commitment. This double standard was so deeply embedded in their thinking that pointing it out directly would have resulted in genuine confusion rather than acknowledgement. My mother in particular operated from a mindset where Derek's needs were perpetually urgent while mine could always wait. If Derek called needing money, she would immediately withdraw funds from savings or put expenses on credit cards. If I mentioned financial stress, she would offer advice about budgeting more carefully. If Derek arrived at the house with one of his children, she would drop whatever she was doing to provide childcare. If I asked for help with something in my life, she would explain that she was too busy with family obligations. The pattern was so consistent that I eventually stopped asking for anything because the inevitable rejection felt more painful than simply managing everything alone. I learned that being the responsible child meant being the child whose needs were never prioritized, because I could be counted on to handle things independently, while Derek required constant support and intervention. My father's relationship with Derek was complicated by his own frustrated ambitions for the landscaping business. Dad had built Castellanos Landscaping Services into a respectable operation, but it remained a small company in a competitive industry where growth required either significant capital investment or exceptional business acumen. He lacked both, and as he aged, the physical demands of the work became increasingly difficult. His vision had been that Derek would take over the company, bring youthful energy and new ideas, and expand it into something more substantial that could provide security for the entire family. This vision required ignoring substantial evidence that Derek possessed neither the work ethic nor the business sense necessary for such responsibility. Derek worked for the company sporadically throughout his 20s and early 30s, but his employment was characterized by chronic absenteeism, customer complaints about incomplete work, and financial irregularities when he was entrusted with handling payments or purchasing supplies. Dad would become frustrated, implement new systems to hold Derek accountable, and then gradually relax those systems when Derek complained or when Mom intervened on his behalf. The cycle repeated endlessly, with Dad oscillating between anger at Derek's irresponsibility and hope that maturity would eventually transform his son into the partner he needed. The arrival of each grandchild briefly renewed Dad's optimism that fatherhood would inspire Derek to become more serious about his obligations, and each time that optimism proved unfounded, Dad would rationalize the failure as Derek needing more time or support, rather than facing the reality that his son was fundamentally unsuited for the responsibilities being projected onto him. My own relationship with the family business was negligible despite having actual interest and aptitude for the operational and financial aspects that Dad struggled with. During high school and college, I had occasionally helped with administrative tasks like invoicing, scheduling, and customer communications. I had natural organizational skills and quickly identified inefficiencies in how the business operated. I suggested implementing software systems to track jobs more effectively, developing marketing materials to reach higher-end clients, and creating maintenance contracts that would provide steady income rather than relying entirely on one-time projects. Dad listened politely to my suggestions but rarely implemented them, and when I pressed him on why perfectly viable improvements were being ignored, he would explain that I did not understand the landscaping industry or that such changes were more complicated than I realized. The unspoken message was that the business was Derek's future regardless of competence or interest, and my role was to support that vision rather than imagine alternative arrangements. This family system, with its complicated loyalties, unexamined assumptions, and deeply rooted double standards, was the context in which Derek's pattern of serial pregnancies unfolded. Each time a girlfriend became pregnant, my parents responded with immediate mobilization of family resources to manage the situation. The focus was always on the children's needs and the practical requirements of providing stable care, rather than on holding Derek accountable for his choices or insisting he develop the capacity to manage fatherhood independently. My participation in this system began gradually and innocuously, helping occasionally with babysitting or errands, but evolved through small increments into full-scale surrogate parenting that consumed my life. The insidious nature of this progression was that each individual request seemed reasonable in isolation. Could I watch Aiden for a few hours while Mom ran errands? Of course, I loved my nephew and a few hours was no significant imposition. Could I pick up Aiden from preschool since I finished work earlier than Mom? Certainly my schedule was flexible and it made logistical sense. Could I handle bedtime a few nights per week because Mom was exhausted? Absolutely, she had done so much already and deserved rest. Each accommodation created the foundation for the next request, and within months I had transitioned from occasional helper to primary caregiver, without any formal discussion or acknowledgement that my role had fundamentally changed. The psychological mechanism that trapped me in this pattern was a combination of genuine love for the children and inability to see my own boundaries as legitimate. I did love Aiden, Sophia, Marcus, and Isabella with an intensity that surprised me. They were innocent people who had not chosen their circumstances and who deserved stable, loving care regardless of their father's failures. My training in social work had reinforced the principle that children's needs take precedence over adult grievances, and I saw clear evidence daily of how my presence positively impacted their development. Aiden struggled academically, but improved dramatically when I provided consistent homework support. Sophia had behavioral issues at school that resolved when she had predictable routines at home. Marcus had speech delays that improved with the therapy appointments I researched and transported him to. Isabella was a fussy baby who seemed to calm most readily when I held her. The tangible evidence of my positive impact made it feel morally wrong to withdraw that support even as the cost to my own life became increasingly unsustainable. Simultaneously, I had internalized family messages about the illegitimacy of prioritizing my own needs over collective family obligations. When I felt resentment about sacrificing evenings and weekends to childcare, I interpreted that resentment as moral failure, rather than reasonable response to unjust circumstances. When I felt angry at Derek for his chronic irresponsibility, I suppressed that anger because expressing it would violate family norms about maintaining harmonious relationships. When I felt envious of friends who had freedom to pursue graduate education, travel, or simply rest after work, I judged that envy as selfishness rather than natural desire for the opportunities one had earned through my own efforts. The family system had taught me that being a good person meant endless self-sacrifice without complaint, and I had accepted that lesson so thoroughly that recognizing my own exploitation required years of accumulated damage before I could acknowledge what was happening. My professional work as a case manager for foster youth provided strange counterpoint to my personal situation. I spent my days advocating for teenagers who were aging out of the child welfare system, helping them access resources, navigate bureaucratic systems, and envision futures that transcended their traumatic histories. I was skilled at identifying when adults in these young people's lives were exploiting them, when family members were making unreasonable demands, when systems were failing to provide necessary support. I could clearly see dysfunction in other people's circumstances and advocate effectively for boundaries and support. Yet I was completely unable to apply those same analytical skills to my own situation. The disconnect between my professional competence and personal blindness was profound and would have been comical if the consequences had not been so damaging. Part of this disconnect stemmed from the fundamental difference between chosen profession and inherited family. I could advocate for my clients because I had professional boundaries, limited involvement, and ethical guidelines that defined appropriate relationships. With my family, there were no clear boundaries, involvement was total and lifelong, and the guidelines were unwritten rules about loyalty and obligation that shifted based on who was invoking them. I also had emotional investment in maintaining belief that my family loved me and valued me, even as their treatment suggested otherwise. Acknowledging that I was being exploited would have required facing the painful reality that my parents loved me conditionally based on my utility, that my brother cared more about his own convenience than my well-being, and that the family narrative about mutual support was actually a system where I provided support and others consumed it without reciprocity. The breaking point when it finally arrived was not triggered by any single dramatic event, but rather by accumulation reaching a threshold where continuation became psychologically impossible. Derek's announcement of the fifth pregnancy was the catalyst, but the actual transformation in my thinking had been developing through smaller realizations over the preceding months. I had begun noticing how my body was manifesting the stress through chronic tension headaches, digestive problems, and exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to address. I had begun acknowledging how isolated I had become, with friendships reduced to occasional text message exchanges and social invitations that I always declined because I lacked time or energy. I had begun recognizing that I was 33 years old with no romantic relationship, no significant savings, no clear path toward the life I had once imagined for myself, and no indication that my circumstances would change unless I forced that change. The immediate trigger was not just Derek's announcement but his tone while making it. He sounded excited and optimistic, as though this fifth child would be different from the previous four, as though the pattern would somehow not repeat despite zero evidence supporting that belief. His excitement implicitly assumed my continued participation in raising this child, assumed that I would once again subordinate my life to managing consequences of his choices. The assumption was so complete that he had not even considered whether to ask for my help because my help was simply expected as natural feature of family dynamics. That assumption, more than the pregnancy itself, activated something in me that had been building pressure for over a decade. I suddenly saw with absolute clarity that nothing would change unless I changed it, that Derek would continue creating chaos and I would continue managing it until I explicitly refused, and that my family would never voluntarily acknowledge the unfairness of this arrangement because it served their needs perfectly as currently structured. The decision to set a boundary was terrifying, because it meant accepting several painful truths simultaneously. It meant acknowledging that my family's love was conditional on my compliance with their expectations. It meant recognizing that my years of sacrifice had not been appreciated or even noticed as sacrifice but rather had been treated as my natural role. It meant facing the possibility that asserting my own needs would result in rejection and loss of relationships I still valued despite their dysfunction. It meant accepting that I could not save Derek from himself, could not force my parents to distribute expectations more fairly, and could not continue protecting the children I loved without destroying myself in the process. These truths were devastating to confront after spending over a decade trying to believe different narratives, trying to convince myself that my sacrifice was temporary and would eventually be rewarded with recognition or reciprocity. The clarity that emerged from finally articulating my boundary was profound despite the fear accompanying it. For the first time in my adult life, I had stated clearly what I would and would not do, had asserted that my life belonged to me rather than to family obligations, and had rejected the premise that my needs were less important than everyone else's convenience. The words had been simple, but they represented fundamental rejection of the family system that had shaped me. I was claiming the right to define my own identity independent of family expectations, to prioritize my own well-being over collective demands, and to refuse participation in dynamics that harmed me regardless of how those dynamics were justified through appeals to family loyalty or children's needs. The silence following my group text message was ominous because it represented my family's need to regroup and develop strategy for bringing me back into compliance. I knew my parents well enough to predict that their initial response would be shock followed by attempts to guilt me into reconsidering. They would frame my boundary as abandonment of innocent children rather than reasonable limit setting with an irresponsible adult. They would invoke family loyalty and cultural values, suggesting that my education and exposure to American individualism had corrupted my understanding of proper family relationships. They would express disappointment and hurt, making my boundary into something I was doing to them rather than something I was doing for myself. They would likely enlist other family members to pressure me, creating chorus of voices all insisting that I was wrong and needed to reconsider. I spent the evening after setting my boundary in strange state of emotional suspension, simultaneously relieved and anxious. I had been carrying weight for so long that its sudden absence felt disorienting rather than immediately liberating. I kept expecting someone to arrive at my apartment demanding conversation or explanation, kept checking my phone despite having silenced notifications, kept mentally rehearsing arguments I would need to make when the confrontation inevitably occurred. Sleep was difficult that night, my mind cycling through years of memories and attempting to reconcile the story I had told myself about my family with the reality I was finally acknowledging. I thought about my mother's genuine belief that she was teaching me important values about family loyalty, thought about my father's inability to see his different treatment of Derek and me, thought about Derek's sincere confusion when confronted with his pattern because he had never been required to examine it critically. I also thought about the children and felt complicated guilt about how my boundary would impact them. They loved me and depended on me, and my withdrawal would hurt them regardless of how justified my reasons were. Aiden at 9 years old was old enough to understand that I was choosing to be less present in his life, and I knew that understanding would feel like rejection. Sophia at 6 was anxious and needed consistency that my absence would disrupt. Marcus at 3 was still young enough that he might adjust quickly, but Isabella at 18 months knew me as primary caregiver, and my disappearance from her daily routine would be confusing and distressing. The guilt about hurting these innocent people was nearly sufficient to make me reconsider my boundary before it had even been truly tested. Nearly, but not quite, because I was finally recognizing that continuing to sacrifice myself would ultimately harm them as well by modeling dysfunction and teaching them that exploitative relationships were normal and acceptable. As I finally fell into restless sleep that night, I understood that the real challenge was not the initial statement of my boundary, but rather maintaining it when pressured to reconsider. I had spent 33 years learning to prioritize others' needs over my own, to interpret my own desires as selfishness, to accept whatever role the family assigned me without question. Changing those deeply embedded patterns would require sustained effort and willingness to disappoint people whose approval I still desperately wanted despite everything. The journey I had begun with a single phone call and text message would require transforming not just my behavior, but my fundamental understanding of who I was and what I deserved. That transformation would be neither quick nor easy, but for the first time in over a decade, I believed it was possible and necessary. The alternative was continuing to disappear into obligations that would consume whatever remained of my own life and potential. The confrontation I had been anticipating arrived the following evening, when my mother appeared at my apartment unannounced. I lived in a modest one-bedroom unit in a complex about 20 minutes from my parents' house, close enough that dropping by without warning was feasible but far enough that such visits required deliberate effort. I had chosen this distance carefully years ago, wanting some buffer between my adult life and the constant demands of the household I had grown up in, though that buffer had proved largely ineffective given how thoroughly family obligations had penetrated every aspect of my existence. I was preparing a simple dinner after an exhausting day at work when the knock came. Through the peephole I saw my mother standing in the hallway holding a large canvas bag that I recognized as the one she used for transporting food containers. My immediate instinct was to pretend I was not home, to avoid the conversation I knew was coming, but I recognized that postponing the confrontation would only prolong the anxiety without changing the inevitable outcome. I opened the door and stepped aside to let her enter, already feeling the familiar tug of guilt and obligation that her presence always activated. Rosa entered my apartment with the same purposeful energy she brought to every task, moving immediately to the kitchen counter to unpack the containers she had brought. There was rice, beans, chicken and mole sauce, fresh tortillas wrapped in foil, and a container of the fruit salad I had loved as a child. The food was both a gesture of care and a strategic manipulation, a reminder of all the ways she had nurtured me, and an implicit suggestion that refusing her requests meant rejecting that nurturing. She arranged the containers on my counter with precision, narrating as she worked about how she had made extra specifically for me, how she knew I probably was not eating properly with my demanding schedule, how family took care of one another through acts of service like this. I thanked her for the food while my stomach twisted with the knowledge that accepting it created obligation, and refusing it would constitute rejection of more than just a meal. This was the complicated calculus that governed every interaction in my family, where simple transactions were loaded with multiple layers of meaning and consequence. I waited for her to finish unpacking before asking directly why she had come, wanting to establish that I understood this was not simply a social visit or maternal gesture, but rather the opening move in an attempt to change my position. My mother settled herself at my small dining table and looked at me with an expression that combined hurt, confusion, and determination. She began by saying that she had been very upset since receiving my text message the previous day, that she had not slept well because she was worried about me and about the children, that she could not understand what had happened to make me send such a harsh message. Her framing was immediate and strategic, characterizing my boundary as something that had happened to me rather than something I had chosen, as harsh rather than reasonable, as requiring explanation rather than acceptance. She was positioning herself as the concerned mother trying to understand her troubled daughter, rather than as someone whose own behavior had contributed to the situation. I told her calmly that nothing had happened to me beyond finally recognizing a pattern that had been damaging me for over a decade. I explained that I loved Aiden, Sophia, Marcus, and Isabella, but that my role in their lives had long ago exceeded what was reasonable to expect from an aunt. I pointed out that I had been providing the majority of their daily care while Derek contributed minimally despite being their father, that this arrangement had prevented me from pursuing my own goals and relationships, and that I could not continue sacrificing my life to enable Derek's irresponsibility. I spoke carefully and deliberately, trying to remain calm despite the emotional intensity of finally articulating these thoughts to the person who had most shaped my understanding of family obligation. My mother listened with an expression that suggested she was waiting for me to finish, rather than actually considering what I was saying. When I paused, she responded with the arguments I had anticipated, delivered with the conviction of someone who genuinely believed the worldview she was expressing. She reminded me that family always comes first, that the children were innocent and deserved stable care regardless of Derek's failings, that I had education and career success that positioned me to help in ways that others in the family could not. She said that she had raised both Derek and me largely alone while my father worked long hours building his business, that she had never complained about the sacrifice because that was what mothers did, that my unwillingness to help with the children suggested I did not understand what real sacrifice looked like. The comparison between her experience and mine was both unfair and revealing. She had chosen to have children and had raised her own offspring, a fundamentally different situation from being expected to raise someone else's children without choice or formal recognition. She had a partner who was working to support the family even if his physical presence was limited, while I was single and managing everything alone. She had been in her 20s when she became a mother, while I was in my 30s watching opportunities disappear because of obligations I had never agreed to assume. But pointing out these distinctions would require challenging her narrative about sacrifice and family loyalty, something she was not prepared to consider. I attempted to explain the difference between helping family members in crisis and becoming a permanent solution to someone else's chronic irresponsibility. I emphasized that my issue was not with the children but with the expectation that I would continue enabling Derek to avoid the consequences of his choices. I said that if I kept rescuing him, he would never develop the capacity to be the father his children needed, and that my withdrawal might actually force him to grow in ways that continued support prevented. This framing was strategic, attempting to recast my boundary as ultimately serving everyone's long-term interests rather than simply prioritizing my own needs. But I could see from my mother's expression that she was not convinced. Rosa shifted her approach, moving from appeals to family values toward more personal attacks designed to activate shame and guilt. She suggested that my education had made me think I was better than the family that had sacrificed to provide that education, that my career success had created distance and judgment where there should be humility and gratitude. She said that watching me become cold and selfish had been painful for her, that she had raised me to be generous and caring but something had changed me into someone who could turn her back on innocent children. She invoked my memory of being young and vulnerable, asking whether I would have wanted my aunt to abandon me if my own parents had struggled, whether I remembered what it felt like to need support and care from extended family. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated and drew on deep wells of insecurity and guilt that my mother knew how to access with precision. I felt the familiar destabilization that her disapproval always created, the sense that perhaps I was being selfish and ungrateful, that perhaps my perspective was distorted by values that contradicted what really mattered. The fact that I could recognize the manipulation intellectually did not prevent it from affecting me emotionally, and I felt my resolve wavering under the weight of her disappointment and the implications that I was betraying fundamental aspects of my identity and values. I took several deep breaths before responding, needing to center myself and remember why I had set this boundary despite how difficult maintaining it felt. I told my mother that I appreciated everything she and my father had done to provide opportunities for me, that my education had been possible only because of their sacrifice, and that I would always be grateful for that foundation. However, I continued, gratitude did not mean unlimited obligation, or the surrender of my own life to manage consequences of Derek's choices. I said that I had given 11 years to helping raise his children, that I had sacrificed career advancement and personal relationships and financial stability to provide care that he should have been providing, and that continuing indefinitely would mean accepting that my life had no value beyond serving family needs. My mother's response revealed the fundamental disconnect between our worldviews. She said that life was not about individual fulfillment or personal goals, but about family and community, and the obligations that held societies together. She argued that American culture had poisoned me with ideas about self-actualization and independence that were ultimately hollow and lonely, that the path I was choosing would lead to isolation and regret. She predicted that I would end up alone without the family support that I was now rejecting, that when I was older and needed help there would be no one willing to provide it, because I had demonstrated that I only cared about myself. The threats were subtle but clear, suggesting that setting this boundary would result in permanent exclusion from family support systems that I might someday need. The conversation continued in circles for nearly 2 hours, with my mother presenting variations on the same themes, and me attempting to hold my position, while feeling increasingly exhausted and destabilized. She deployed every strategy available to her, including tears, anger, pleading, guilt, shame, threats of consequences, and appeals to shared memories and values. She reminded me of specific moments when family support had been crucial in my own life, instances when relatives had helped with childcare or financial assistance or emotional support during difficult periods. She characterized my boundary as betrayal of those people who had helped me, as if accepting help created permanent debt that could be called in at any time regardless of the reasonableness of the demand. I remained as calm as I could manage while reiterating that I was not abandoning the children but rather changing my role from primary caregiver to aunt who visited and maintained relationships within reasonable boundaries. I emphasized that Derek was their father and needed to figure out how to be present and responsible for them, that my continued rescue of him prevented that necessary development. I pointed out that my parents had enabled Derek's irresponsibility for over 3 decades, and that perhaps different approaches might yield better results. This last observation was a mistake, as it shifted the conversation from my boundary to implied criticism of my parents' parenting, which my mother interpreted as disrespectful and ungrateful. Rosa stood abruptly, her expression hardening into something cold that I had rarely seen directed at me. She said that I was clearly determined to be selfish regardless of the harm it caused innocent children, that she was deeply disappointed in who I had become, and that she hoped I could live with the consequences of my choices. She gathered her purse and moved toward the door, leaving the food containers on my counter as a final gesture whose meaning was ambiguous. Was the food still an offering of care, or was leaving it a pointed reminder of what I would be losing by refusing family obligations? Before she left, she delivered a final statement that landed with the weight she intended. She said that my father would be visiting me soon to discuss the situation, and that I should prepare for that conversation because his patience with my attitude was exhausted. The door closed behind her with restrained force, not quite a slam but sufficient to convey anger and rejection. I stood in my small kitchen surrounded by containers of food that now felt contaminated by the conversation, visual reminders of the complicated dynamics where care and manipulation were so thoroughly intertwined as to be inseparable. I felt hollowed out by the confrontation, uncertain whether I had successfully held my boundary, or whether my mother had planted sufficient seeds of doubt and guilt that my resolve would eventually collapse. The prospect of a similar conversation with my father filled me with dread because I knew his approach would be different but potentially more effective given my lifelong desire for his approval and recognition. I did not eat the food my mother had brought, instead leaving the containers on the counter where they remained for 2 days as I tried to process the conversation and steel myself for whatever came next. Sleep continued to be difficult, my mind replaying the confrontation and generating alternative responses I might have offered, better arguments that might have made my position clearer or more defensible. I recognize this mental pattern as characteristic of people who had been trained to believe that if only they could explain their position perfectly, the other person would finally understand and accept it. This belief was based on the false assumption that the conflict was about misunderstanding rather than about fundamentally different priorities and values. My work suffered during this period as I struggled to maintain focus while processing the emotional aftermath of the confrontation and anticipating the next one. My clients needed my full attention and advocacy, but I found myself distracted and irritable, less patient with bureaucratic obstacles and less creative in problem-solving than I normally was. One of my colleagues, a woman named Jennifer who had become something of a work friend despite my general isolation, noticed my distraction and asked if everything was all right. I provided a vague response about family stress, not wanting to explain the full situation but needing acknowledgement that I was struggling. Jennifer's response surprised me with its directness and perception. She said that she had noticed over the years that I often seemed exhausted, and that she had wondered whether something difficult was happening in my personal life. She shared briefly that she had grown up in a family where boundary setting was treated as betrayal, and that learning to prioritize her own well-being had been the hardest and most important work of her adult life. She did not press me for details but offered that if I ever wanted to talk, she was available to listen without judgment. Her kindness and implicit understanding of my situation without requiring full disclosure created the first small crack in the isolation I had been maintaining around my personal struggles. That brief conversation planted a seed that would become important in the coming weeks, the recognition that perhaps my experience was not as unique or shameful as I had been taught to believe, that other people had faced similar dynamics and survived the process of setting boundaries. Jennifer's offer of support was the first time in recent memory that someone had acknowledged my needs without immediately pivoting to how I should be meeting others' needs, and that simple validation felt more nourishing than I had anticipated. I did not take her up on the offer immediately, still too conditioned to manage everything alone, but knowing the offer existed provided a psychological safety net that made the continuing family conflict slightly more bearable. The anticipated conversation with my father occurred 3 days after my mother's visit. Miguel called in the late afternoon asking if he could stop by after work to discuss some important family matters. His tone was formal and controlled, suggesting that this would be a serious conversation requiring my full attention and respect. I agreed to the meeting despite my anxiety because refusing would have been interpreted as cowardice or inability to defend my position, and I was determined to demonstrate that my boundary was based on thoughtful consideration, rather than emotional impulse or temporary frustration. My father arrived precisely on time, still wearing his work clothes with dirt stains on his jeans and the smell of grass clippings and earth clinging to him. He had always worked physically even as his company grew, unable to fully transition to purely managerial functions, and his body showed the accumulated toll of decades of manual labor. At 61, he moved with a careful stiffness that suggested chronic pain managed but never fully resolved. I offered him water and a seat at the dining table, and we sat across from each other in a configuration that felt uncomfortably formal and adversarial. Miguel began by acknowledging that he understood I was frustrated with Derek, and that Derek had made many mistakes that created difficulties for the family. This opening surprised me with its apparent concession, and I felt momentary hope that perhaps my father would be more receptive than my mother had been to my perspective. However, he quickly pivoted to the central message he had come to deliver. Regardless of Derek's failures, he said, the children were family and family took care of its own. He explained that he and my mother were getting older and could not manage the physical demands of caring for 4 young children indefinitely, that they needed my help to ensure the children had stable and loving care, and that refusing that help was not acceptable within the family structure. The framing was revealing in its assumption that my life existed primarily to serve family needs, that my help was something that could be required rather than requested, and that my refusal constituted violation of family rules rather than reasonable boundary setting. I responded by reiterating the points I had made to my mother about the unsustainability of my current role, and the need for Derek to assume genuine responsibility for his children. My father listened with an expression that suggested he was tolerating my position rather than considering it seriously, and when I finished he delivered the message I suspected had been his primary purpose for visiting. He said that if I was determined to refuse family obligations, then I needed to understand the consequences of that choice. He and my mother had helped me significantly over the years with college expenses, car repairs, moving costs, and various other financial supports that I had perhaps forgotten but that they had tracked. He suggested that someone who was unwilling to help family when needed should not expect to receive help from family in the future, and that I should be prepared to manage my life completely independently if I maintained my current position. He also mentioned that his business had purchased furniture and design services from my company over the years, orders that had represented significant revenue for my small operation, and that those business relationships would naturally end if family relationships deteriorated. The threat was delivered calmly and framed as natural consequence rather than punishment, but the message was unmistakable. If I refused to continue raising Derek's children, I would lose family support systems, business relationships, and the financial safety net that family connections provided. I would be choosing isolation and economic vulnerability for the sake of selfishness and stubbornness, and I would have no one to blame but myself when I inevitably struggled without family backing. The threat was particularly effective because it activated fears about financial security that had been cultivated throughout my upbringing, warnings about how quickly fortunes could change, and how essential family networks were for survival in an unstable world. I felt anger rising through my exhaustion and fear, anger at the manipulation disguised as natural consequences, anger at the transactional framing of family relationships where love and support were conditional on compliance with expectations. I told my father that I found it revealing that family loyalty was being defined exclusively in terms of what I provided rather than what I received, that the threat to withdraw business and support demonstrated exactly the conditional nature of the love I had been trying for years to believe was unconditional. I said that if family relationships could be ended because I refused to continue sacrificing my life for Derek's mistakes, then perhaps those relationships were not as valuable as I had been taught to believe. My father's expression hardened into disappointment and dismissal. He stood, clearly considering the conversation finished, and delivered his final statement with the authority of a patriarch making an unchallengeable decree. He said I had 1 week to reconsider my position, that after that time the family would move forward without me, and that I should think carefully about whether my pride was worth the isolation I was choosing. He left without further conversation, and I was alone again in my apartment trying to process the ultimatum I had just received and decide whether I possessed the strength to maintain my boundary when doing so meant losing nearly everything that had structured my life. The week following my father's ultimatum became a period of profound internal reckoning that forced me to examine every assumption I had held about family, obligation, and self-worth. I existed in a state of constant anxiety punctuated by moments of unexpected clarity, oscillating between certainty that my boundary was justified and terror, that I was making a catastrophic mistake that would leave me permanently isolated and unsupported. The 1-week deadline created artificial urgency designed to pressure me into compliance before I could fully process the implications of my choice, and I recognized this manipulation, even as I felt its effectiveness. During those 7 days, I received no direct communication from my parents or Derek, a silence that felt more ominous than confrontation would have been. The absence of contact suggested coordination and strategy, a deliberate choice to let me sit with my decision and imagine all the negative consequences that would follow if I maintained my position. This silent treatment was a familiar tactic from my childhood, employed whenever I had violated family expectations in some way. The withdrawal of attention and affection created a void that I was meant to fill with anxiety and eventual capitulation, returning to proper behavior through the discomfort of exclusion, rather than through explicit punishment or argument. I maintained my work routine with difficulty, arriving at the office each morning and attempting to focus on the cases demanding my attention. My clients were teenagers aging out of foster care who faced housing instability, educational barriers, and the overwhelming challenge of navigating adult systems without the family support that most young people took for granted. The irony of my professional role was not lost on me during this period. I spent my days advocating for young people who had been failed by their families and systems, helping them recognize their own worth independent of the neglect or abuse they had experienced, teaching them to set boundaries with toxic family members who attempted to exploit them once they aged out of state supervision. Yet in my personal life, I struggled to apply these same principles to my own family dynamics. One of my clients during this period was a young woman named Destiny who was 19 years old and attempting to maintain her housing while working full-time at a fast food restaurant and attending community college part-time. Her mother had recently contacted her after years of absence, claiming to have transformed her life and wanting to rebuild their relationship. Destiny was conflicted because she desperately wanted maternal connection, but also recognized patterns in her mother's behavior that suggested the reconciliation was motivated by the mother's need for money, rather than genuine desire for relationship. During our meeting that week, Destiny asked me directly how to know whether she was being selfish by refusing her mother's request for financial help, or whether setting boundaries was appropriate self-protection. I found myself providing Destiny with advice that I simultaneously needed to hear and apply to my own situation. I explained that loving someone did not obligate her to sacrifice her own stability to enable their dysfunction, that setting boundaries was not selfishness but rather healthy self-preservation, and that people who genuinely cared about her well-being would respect reasonable limits rather than demanding unlimited access to her resources. I told her that she could love her mother, while also recognizing that their relationship needed to be structured in ways that protected Destiny from exploitation. As I spoke these words with conviction about Destiny's situation, I felt the cognitive dissonance of my inability to fully embrace them regarding my own family circumstances. After the meeting concluded, I sat in my office recognizing that I was able to see clearly in other people's situations what remained murky in my own. The difference was emotional investment, and the hope that somehow my family's behavior toward me was fundamentally different from the exploitation I witnessed in my clients' lives. I wanted to believe that my parents loved me unconditionally, and that their pressure was motivated by genuine concern, rather than by the desire to maintain a system that served their needs at my expense. Confronting the possibility that my family's love was transactional and conditional in the same ways as the dysfunctional families I encountered professionally was deeply painful and threatening to my identity. Jennifer, my colleague who had earlier offered support, noticed my distraction and invited me to have coffee after work. I initially deflected, accustomed to managing everything privately, but she persisted with gentle pressure that suggested she understood more about my situation than I had disclosed. We went to a cafe near the office where the ambient noise provided sufficient privacy for conversation without the intensity of complete silence. Jennifer began by sharing more of her own story about growing up in a family where her role had been to absorb everyone else's emotional chaos and practical needs, while her own needs were dismissed as less important or simply unacknowledged. She described a pattern remarkably similar to what I was experiencing, where family members had treated her success and stability as resources to be exploited rather than achievements to be celebrated. She had eventually set boundaries that her family initially responded to with anger, threats, and predictions that she would regret her selfishness. The boundary setting had indeed resulted in a period of estrangement that had been profoundly painful, but it had also created space for her to develop her own identity and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. Over time, some family members had adjusted to the new boundaries and relationships had been rebuilt on healthier foundations, while others had remained unable to accept limits, and those relationships had ended or become more distant. Jennifer's story provided a roadmap for what I might expect if I maintained my boundary, both the difficulties of the transition and the possibility of eventual resolution that honored my needs rather than requiring their complete subordination. She emphasized that the hardest part had been tolerating the discomfort of disapproval and the fear of permanent isolation, that her conditioning to prioritize others' needs had made every moment of boundary maintenance feel like selfish cruelty even when intellectually she knew she was making necessary choices for her own well-being. She said that therapy had been essential for her process, providing external validation and support, when her entire family system was united in insisting she was wrong. The suggestion of therapy had occurred to me periodically over the years, but I had always dismissed it as unnecessary or self-indulgent, something for people with more serious problems than mine. Jennifer gently challenged this dismissal, pointing out that my situation was objectively serious given the extent to which family obligations had consumed my life and prevented me from pursuing my own goals. She offered the name of the therapist she had worked with, a woman who specialized in family systems and boundary issues, and encouraged me to at least schedule an initial consultation. The suggestion planted itself in my mind despite my resistance, a small seed of possibility that professional support might help me navigate what I was facing. That evening, I returned to my apartment and finally allowed myself to engage with questions I had been avoiding. What did I actually want my life to look like? If I were not defined primarily by family obligations, who would I be and what would I pursue? The questions were surprisingly difficult to answer because I had spent so many years subordinating my desires to others' needs that I had largely lost touch with what I genuinely wanted independent of those obligations. I attempted to make lists of goals and aspirations, but found myself censoring possibilities as unrealistic or selfish before fully articulating them. The internal critical voice that dismissed my needs sounded remarkably like my mother, suggesting how thoroughly I had internalized family messages about what constituted appropriate ambition and desire. I forced myself to continue the exercise despite discomfort, writing down possibilities without immediately evaluating their feasibility or worth. I wrote that I wanted to pursue a graduate degree in social work to expand my clinical skills and career options. I wrote that I wanted to travel internationally to places I had only read about but never had time or resources to visit. I wrote that I wanted to be in a romantic relationship with someone who valued my partnership rather than my utility. I wrote that I wanted financial stability and savings rather than living perpetually on the edge, because my income was stretched covering expenses for children who were not my responsibility. I wrote that I wanted friendships that involved reciprocal support, rather than one-sided caretaking. I wrote that I wanted time for hobbies and creative pursuits that I had abandoned years ago, when childcare obligations consumed all my free time. Looking at the list created both longing and grief, recognition of how much I had sacrificed and how many years had passed while I deferred my own life in service to family needs. I was 33 years old and had spent my entire adult life essentially paused, waiting for some undefined future moment when I would finally be released from obligations and permitted to pursue my own goals. The realization that such a moment would never arrive, unless I created it, was both empowering and terrifying. No external authority would grant me permission to prioritize myself. Either I would claim that right despite opposition, or I would continue indefinitely in the pattern that had defined the past decade. The week progressed with increasing emotional intensity as the deadline approached. I experienced physical symptoms of stress, including tension headaches, nausea, and difficulty sleeping that left me exhausted and foggy. I caught myself engaging in magical thinking, imagining scenarios where my family would suddenly understand and support my boundary, where Derek would have an epiphany about his responsibilities and transform into an engaged father, where my parents would recognize the unfairness of their expectations and apologize for the burden they had placed on me. These fantasies were comforting but ultimately unhelpful, because they kept me oriented toward external validation and change, rather than accepting that I could only control my own choices and responses. On the 5th day of the week, I received an unexpected text message from Simone, Derek's current girlfriend and the mother of Isabella. The message was brief, but its vulnerability was evident. She wrote that she had heard about my conversation with Derek and my decision to step back from helping with the children. She said she understood my position even though it scared her, because she had been relying on my support more than she had realized. She asked if we could meet to talk, not to pressure me to change my decision, but to understand what it meant for her and Isabella going forward. The request was respectful in a way that my parents and Derek's communications had not been, acknowledging my autonomy while also expressing her own concerns. I agreed to meet Simone for coffee the following day, curious about her perspective and also recognizing that she was the person in this situation who had the least power and the most to lose. Simone had not created the family dynamic that made me the default caretaker. She had entered a relationship with Derek, presumably expecting him to be an active partner in parenting, and my presence had likely enabled him to avoid that responsibility in ways that harmed both Simone and me. When we met at a cafe midway between our respective homes, Simone looked exhausted in a way I recognized from my own mirror. She was thin in a way that suggested weight loss from stress rather than intentional dieting, and her usually careful appearance showed signs of neglect, with unwashed hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and clothing that looked slept in. Simone began by thanking me for meeting with her, and immediately clarifying that she was not there to guilt me or try to change my decision. She said that Derek had told her about my boundary and had framed it as me abandoning the family, but that after thinking about it carefully she had come to different conclusions. She recognized that I had been providing the majority of childcare not just for Isabella but for all of Derek's children, and that this arrangement was neither fair nor sustainable. She said that she had initially been grateful for my help when Isabella was born because she was overwhelmed and Derek was largely absent, but that she now recognized that my availability had allowed Derek to avoid stepping up in ways that were damaging their relationship and his relationship with his daughter. Simone shared that she was reconsidering her relationship with Derek because his behavior during her pregnancy and after Isabella's birth had revealed patterns she could no longer ignore. He was minimally present, contributed little to the actual work of parenting, and seemed to expect that women in his life would simply manage everything while he maintained his freedom and minimal responsibility. She said that learning about his other children and the pattern of abandonment he had established with their mothers had been shocking and made her realize she was simply the latest iteration of a cycle he showed no signs of breaking. She was now facing the reality that if she stayed with Derek, she would likely be raising Isabella essentially alone while he moved on to the next relationship and created more children he would not raise. The conversation shifted to more practical matters regarding how my boundary would affect the existing arrangements for Isabella's care. Simone explained that she had been working full-time and relying heavily on me and my parents for childcare because she could not afford to reduce her hours or pay for full-time daycare on her salary alone. Derek contributed some money sporadically but was unreliable, and often claimed he could not afford his share of expenses. Without my help, Simone would need to find alternative childcare arrangements that would strain her already tight budget. She was exploring options including asking her employer about flexible scheduling, researching subsidized childcare programs, and considering whether she could afford to stay in the relationship with Derek or whether single motherhood with clear child support obligations might actually be more stable than the ambiguous arrangement they currently had. I listened to Simone's situation with empathy, and also with recognition that her crisis was not mine to solve. I told her that I cared about Isabella and would be happy to visit occasionally and maintain an aunt relationship, but that I could not continue providing regular childcare or serving as her primary backup plan. I suggested resources I knew about through my work, including childcare assistance programs and legal aid services, if she decided to pursue formal child support arrangements. I acknowledged that my boundary created difficulties for her, but also pointed out that the real problem was Derek's refusal to be a present and responsible parent, not my decision to stop compensating for his absence. Simone nodded in agreement, her eyes filling with tears as she processed the reality of her situation. She said that talking with me had clarified something she had been avoiding, which was that she needed to either accept that she would be essentially a single mother while technically in a relationship with Derek, or she needed to actually become a single mother with legal protections and support obligations rather than relying on informal family arrangements that could disappear. She thanked me for being honest with her and for the resources I had suggested, and we parted with an agreement to stay in touch but without any expectation that I would resume my previous level of involvement in Isabella's care. The meeting with Simone reinforced my understanding that my boundary was necessary not just for my own well-being, but also because it exposed realities that needed to be addressed, rather than perpetually managed. As long as I was available to fill in gaps created by Derek's irresponsibility, the women he involved himself with could maintain illusions about partnership and shared responsibility that prevented them from making clear-eyed decisions about their situations. My withdrawal would force confrontation with reality that was painful in the short term, but potentially healthier in the long term for everyone involved except Derek, whose comfort and freedom depended on women continually sacrificing themselves to manage consequences of his choices. The final 2 days before my father's deadline passed with a surreal quality where time seemed simultaneously to drag and accelerate. I moved through my routines mechanically while internally rehearsing the conversation I would need to have with my parents when the week concluded. I knew they expected me to reconsider and return to compliance, that they had structured the ultimatum assuming that a week of anxiety and isolation would be sufficient to break my resolve. I also knew that maintaining my boundary would require actually following through on the implications they had outlined, accepting that family relationships would fundamentally change, and that I would lose support systems I had taken for granted throughout my life. On the evening of the 7th day, I called my parents rather than waiting for them to contact me. I wanted to be the one initiating the conversation rather than responding to their timeline and agenda. My mother answered, her voice cautious and expectant. I told her that I had thought carefully about everything they had said during the past week, and that my position remained unchanged. I would not be resuming my role as primary caretaker for Derek's children, and while I hoped we could maintain family relationships within new boundaries, I understood if they chose to withdraw support and contact as they had threatened. I said that I loved them and appreciated everything they had done for me, but that I needed to build a life that honored my own needs and goals, rather than existing solely to serve family obligations. The silence following my statement was heavy with disappointment and anger. My mother's response was cold and formal, stating that I had made my choice and would need to live with the consequences. She said that they would continue to care for Derek's children because that was what family did, and that when I eventually came to my senses and recognized my mistake, we could discuss whether reconciliation was possible. She ended the call without saying goodbye or offering any affection, leaving me listening to the dial tone while tears streamed down my face. The finality of the moment was devastating despite having anticipated this outcome, the confirmation that my family's love was indeed conditional on my compliance with expectations that had no regard for my well-being. I sat with my grief for several hours that evening, allowing myself to feel the full weight of loss without attempting to minimize or rationalize it. I had just chosen my own well-being over family approval, and while I believed intellectually that this was the right choice, emotionally it felt like tearing myself away from the only identity and support system I had ever known. The path forward was uncertain and frightening, but remaining in the old pattern had become psychologically impossible. I had finally said no and meant it, and whatever came next would be shaped by that fundamental choice to claim my own life rather than continuing to live according to others' expectations and needs. The days immediately following my final conversation with my parents felt like existing in a vacuum where familiar reference points had disappeared, and new ones had not yet emerged to replace them. I woke each morning with a moment of disorientation before remembering what had happened, followed by waves of grief, relief, anxiety, and determination that cycled through me in unpredictable patterns. The finality of my parents' rejection sat heavy in my chest, a physical sensation of loss that manifested as tightness and difficulty taking full breaths. Yet beneath the grief was something else, a tentative sense of possibility that began emerging once the initial shock started to subside. The most immediate practical challenge was restructuring my daily routine, which had been organized entirely around childcare obligations for so long that I barely remembered what my time had looked like before those responsibilities accumulated. For 11 years, my mornings had begun with preparing breakfast for whichever children were present, getting them dressed and ready for school or daycare, managing the logistics of transportation and packed lunches and permission slips. My evenings had been consumed with homework assistance, dinner preparation, bath time routines, and the endless cycle of needs that young children generated. My weekends had been structured around children's activities, birthday parties, errands for household supplies, and the constant vigilance that childcare required even during supposedly free time. Suddenly, I had mornings where I could drink coffee slowly, while reading the news rather than mediating sibling conflicts and searching for missing shoes. I had evenings where I could prepare simple meals for only myself or skip cooking entirely if I chose, where I could pursue hobbies or simply sit in silence without anyone requiring my attention. I had weekends stretching before me with no scheduled obligations beyond whatever I chose to create. The freedom was disorienting and initially felt more like emptiness than liberation. I had become so accustomed to defining my time according to others' needs that the absence of those demands left me uncertain about how to structure days according to my own preferences and desires. The emotional complexity of this transition was profound. I felt guilty about the relief I experienced when mornings were calm and evenings were quiet, as though enjoying my freedom meant I had never genuinely loved the children whose care I had provided for so long. I worried constantly about how Aiden, Sophia, Marcus, and Isabella were managing without my presence, whether they felt abandoned or were struggling in ways I was no longer there to address. I imagined scenarios where the children were suffering because of my decision, and these imagined scenarios created intense anxiety that sometimes made me question whether I had made a catastrophic mistake. The guilt was compounded by my awareness that the children had not chosen any of this situation, and were innocent victims of adult dysfunction that they had no power to change. Yet alongside the guilt existed genuine relief that felt almost illicit in its intensity. I recognized with some surprise that I had been exhausted at a level beyond what I had allowed myself to acknowledge while still in the midst of caregiving responsibilities. The exhaustion was not merely physical, though years of insufficient sleep and constant activity had certainly taken their toll. The exhaustion was primarily emotional and psychological, the toll of existing perpetually in service to others' needs without space for my own rest, reflection, or replenishment. Without the constant demands on my attention and energy, I began sleeping more deeply than I had in years. The tension headaches that had become chronic started occurring less frequently. My digestive problems began improving as my stress levels decreased. My body was providing feedback about the unsustainability of the life I had been living. I took Jennifer up on her suggestion to pursue therapy, contacting the therapist whose name she had provided and scheduling an initial consultation. Dr. Patricia Reeves was a woman in her late 50s who specialized in family systems therapy and boundary issues, particularly with clients from immigrant and cultural backgrounds where collective family identity often superseded individual autonomy. Her office was warm and unpretentious, filled with plants and comfortable furniture that created an atmosphere of safety rather than clinical detachment. During our first session, I provided an overview of my family situation and the recent boundary setting that had resulted in estrangement from my parents and brother. Dr. Reeves listened with focused attention that felt different from the polite listening I typically encountered in social contexts. She asked clarifying questions that suggested she understood not just the surface narrative, but also the underlying dynamics and psychological patterns that had enabled the situation to develop as it had. When I finished explaining my circumstances, She stated directly that what I was describing was a parentified-child dynamic where I had been assigned adult responsibilities and emotional burdens from a young age, that the pattern with my brother's children was an extension of long-standing family dysfunction rather than an isolated issue, and that my decision to set boundaries was not only appropriate but necessary for my psychological health and development. Hearing these observations from a professional, who had no investment in maintaining my family's narratives, was simultaneously validating and painful. Validation because it confirmed that my perception of unfairness was accurate, rather than distorted by selfishness or ingratitude. Painful because it required acknowledging that my family's treatment of me reflected genuine dysfunction, rather than cultural difference or unfortunate circumstance that I should accept with greater maturity. Dr. Reeves explained that parentification was a form of emotional abuse where children were required to meet parents' or siblings' needs in ways that prevented the children from developing age-appropriate independence and identity. She said that my extended role in raising Derek's children was simply the adult manifestation of patterns established much earlier in my development. The therapy sessions that followed over subsequent weeks provided crucial support as I navigated the aftermath of my boundary setting and began the difficult work of constructing identity independent of family role. Dr. Reeves helped me identify cognitive distortions that I had internalized from years of family messaging, beliefs that my needs were inherently less important than others' needs, that setting boundaries constituted selfishness and betrayal, that my worth was determined by my utility to others rather than by my inherent value as a person. She introduced concepts from family systems theory that helped me understand how my family had operated as a system where my role was to absorb dysfunction and maintain stability by sacrificing my own development and well-being. One particularly illuminating session focused on the concept of differentiation, the psychological process of developing clear sense of self that is distinct from family identity, while still maintaining connection to family relationships. Dr. Reeves explained that healthy families supported differentiation by encouraging children to develop their own values, goals, and identities while providing a secure base from which to explore. Dysfunctional families resisted differentiation by treating any assertion of independence as betrayal or abandonment, by using guilt and shame to maintain enmeshment, and by threatening rejection whenever boundaries were established. She pointed out that my family's response to my boundary perfectly illustrated this dynamic, where my attempt at differentiation was framed as abandonment and met with threats of permanent exclusion. Understanding these patterns intellectually was helpful, but did not eliminate the emotional difficulty of living through the consequences of my choices. The estrangement from my parents created a void in my daily life that extended beyond the practical absence of contact. I had been accustomed to calling my mother multiple times per week despite the conversations often being stressful, to receiving texts and calls about family matters, to being included in the information flow about extended family news and events. The sudden silence was disorienting and provoked anxiety about what I might be missing, whether my parents were managing adequately without my help, whether something might happen to them and I would not be informed. Derek's response to the situation evolved over the first month following my boundary announcement. After the initial angry conversation, he had been silent for approximately 2 weeks. Then he began sending text messages that alternated between attempts at manipulation and what appeared to be genuine distress. Some messages accused me of abandoning his children and being selfish and cold. Others expressed confusion about how to manage childcare logistics and pleas for me to reconsider just helping temporarily until he figured out permanent solutions. Still others contained updates about the children clearly designed to provoke guilt. Mentions of Aiden struggling with homework without my help, or Sophia having behavioral issues at school, or Marcus asking when Aunt Maya would visit. I did not respond to most of these messages, recognizing them as attempts to draw me back into old patterns through whatever emotional leverage seemed most likely to be effective. However, the messages about the children created intense internal conflict, because I did genuinely care about their well-being, and struggled with uncertainty about whether my boundary was harming them in ways that outweighed the benefits to my own life. Dr. Reeves helped me process these feelings by distinguishing between responsibility and concern. I could be concerned about the children's well-being without being responsible for managing it. Their father and grandparents were responsible for ensuring they had adequate care, and my absence should force those actually responsible parties to develop solutions rather than continuing to rely on my labor. Approximately 6 weeks after my initial boundary announcement, I received an unexpected call from my mother. Her voice when I answered was strained but less hostile than during our last conversation. She said that she had been thinking about our situation and wanted to talk in person if I was willing. The request surprised me because I had assumed the estrangement would continue indefinitely, or until I capitulated and returned to my previous role. I agreed to meet with cautious curiosity about what had prompted this outreach and what agenda she might be pursuing. We met at a neutral location, a park midway between our homes where we could walk and talk with the movement providing distraction from the intensity of direct confrontation. My mother looked older than when I had last seen her, the stress of managing 4 children apparently taking visible toll. She began by acknowledging that the past weeks had been very difficult, that she and my father were exhausted from managing the children's care without my help, and that she was beginning to understand why I had felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities I had been carrying. This acknowledgement was significant because it was the first time she had explicitly recognized the burden rather than treating it as my natural role or expected contribution. However, as the conversation continued, it became clear that my mother's outreach was motivated primarily by practical need, rather than genuine understanding or remorse. She explained that she and my father could not continue managing 4 children indefinitely at their age, that Derek was proving completely unreliable for childcare despite his promises, and that they needed my help at least on a part-time basis. She framed this as compromise rather than return to previous arrangements, suggesting that if I could help with childcare 2 or 3 days per week rather than full-time, it would make the situation manageable for everyone. She said that families should be able to work together to find solutions that served everyone's needs, and that my complete withdrawal was extreme and unnecessary, when more moderate involvement would suffice. I listened to her proposal while feeling familiar pull toward accommodation and guilt about the difficulties my boundary had created for others. The proposition sounded reasonable on its surface, a compromise between total involvement and complete absence. Yet I recognized it as the beginning of incremental return to previous patterns, where agreeing to help 2 days per week would gradually expand to 3 days, then 4, then daily involvement as emergencies arose and temporary needs became permanent expectations. I had learned enough in therapy to recognize this dynamic, and to understand that maintaining my boundary required declining what appeared to be reasonable compromise, but actually represented attempt to restore the dysfunctional system with minor modifications. I told my mother that I appreciated her acknowledgement that the childcare responsibilities were overwhelming, but that I was not willing to resume regular childcare duties in any capacity. I reiterated that I loved the children and was willing to visit occasionally and maintain relationships as their aunt, but that the responsibility for their daily care belonged to their father, and to my parents who had chosen to take on that role. I suggested that they needed to have serious conversations with Derek about his responsibilities, that they might need to pursue legal options like formal custody arrangements or child support enforcement that would create structure and accountability, and that continuing to enable Derek's irresponsibility by compensating for his absence was ultimately harmful to everyone involved, including the children. My mother's expression hardened as she realized I was not going to accept her proposal. She said that I was being rigid and punishing innocent children to make a point about Derek's failings. She accused me of using therapy to become selfish, and to reject family values that I had been raised with. She said that my refusal to compromise demonstrated that I cared more about my own convenience than about family well-being. The conversation ended with tension and disappointment on both sides. My mother frustrated that her outreach had not achieved the desired result, and me exhausted from holding my boundary against emotional manipulation that activated deep guilt and obligation. The interaction confirmed what I was learning in therapy about the pattern of dysfunctional family systems, attempting to reassert control when members tried to differentiate. My mother had made strategic concessions acknowledging that the situation was difficult, but those concessions were designed to draw me back into participation, rather than representing genuine shift in understanding or approach. The fundamental dynamic remained unchanged, with my needs and boundaries treated as less important than family convenience and Derek's freedom from consequences. Maintaining my position required accepting that my parents were unlikely to truly understand my perspective or support my autonomy, and that any relationship we might eventually rebuild would need to be on very different terms than what had existed previously. As difficult as these confrontations were, I was also beginning to experience tangible benefits from the space I had created in my life. With evenings and weekends available for my own pursuits, I enrolled in a watercolor painting class that I had been interested in for years but never had time to attend. The class met Tuesday evenings for 2 hours, and those sessions became an anchoring point in my week, where I could focus entirely on creative expression without any obligations or demands beyond exploring color and technique. I was not particularly talented as a painter, but the process of creating something purely for my own enjoyment rather than to serve any external need was profoundly satisfying in ways I had not anticipated. I also began reconnecting with friendships that had atrophied during the years when I lacked time and energy for maintaining relationships beyond superficial text exchanges. One friend from college, Carmen, lived in the area, but I had not seen her in person for over 2 years despite periodic promises that we would meet for dinner. When I finally reached out and explained that my schedule had opened up significantly, she was enthusiastic about reconnecting. Our dinner together stretched into 3 hours of conversation where I found myself sharing the full story of my family situation and boundary setting for the first time with someone from my pre-family obligations life. Carmen's response was validating and illuminating in its outsider perspective, expressing shock at the extent of the responsibilities I had been carrying and admiration for my decision to prioritize my own well-being. These small steps toward reclaiming my own life created momentum that built on itself, each new experience or reconnection providing evidence that life beyond family obligations held possibility and satisfaction, rather than emptiness and isolation. The fear that had dominated the week of my parents' ultimatum, the terror that setting boundaries would leave me permanently alone and unsupported, was gradually being replaced by recognition that authentic relationships and meaningful pursuits existed outside the dysfunctional family system I had been trapped within. I was beginning to understand that the isolation I had feared was actually what I had been experiencing while enmeshed in family obligations that left no room for genuine connection or self-development, and that the path I had chosen offered potential for much richer and more reciprocal relationships than what I was leaving behind. 3 months into my new life, the landscape of my existence had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The initial disorientation had given way to something resembling equilibrium, though I remained vigilant against complacency or the temptation to believe that the most difficult parts of this transition were behind me. Dr. Reeves had warned me that family systems often escalated their pressure when initial attempts to restore previous dynamics failed, and I was learning to recognize the various strategies my family deployed to draw me back into compliance, even as I developed stronger capacity to resist those pressures. My work life had begun to flourish in unexpected ways once I had mental and emotional bandwidth to invest more fully in my professional development. The executive director of the nonprofit where I worked had noticed my renewed energy and focus, commenting during a supervision meeting that I seemed more present and engaged than she had observed in recent years. When I explained briefly that I had made significant changes in my personal life that freed up capacity for professional growth, she responded by asking whether I would be interested in taking on additional responsibilities, including supervision of newer case managers and participation in program development initiatives that would expand our services to better meet client needs. The opportunity represented exactly the kind of professional advancement I had been postponing for years, always believing that I lacked sufficient time or energy to take on expanded roles while managing family obligations. Accepting the new responsibilities would mean modest salary increase, along with valuable experience that could position me for future leadership roles, or provide foundation for eventually pursuing graduate education in social work administration. I accepted the offer with a mixture of excitement and residual guilt about benefiting from choices that had caused pain to people I cared about, though therapy was helping me recognize that feeling guilty about positive outcomes perpetuated dysfunctional patterns rather than honoring legitimate concerns. The expanded professional role brought me into closer collaboration with Jennifer, who served as lead case manager, and would be working with me to develop training protocols for new staff. Our working relationship deepened into genuine friendship as we spent more time together both in professional contexts and occasional social interactions after work. Jennifer's understanding of family dysfunction and boundary setting from her own experience made her uniquely valuable as a confidant who could provide perspective without judgment. She had successfully navigated the terrain I was still learning to traverse, and her presence in my life served as evidence that the path I had chosen led somewhere worth reaching. During one of our after-work conversations, Jennifer shared that she had observed significant transformation in me over the 3 months since I had first confided about my family situation. She said that I carried myself differently, with less of the perpetual exhaustion and anxiety that had characterized my demeanor previously. She noted that I smiled more readily, engaged more fully in conversations rather than seeming partially distracted by concerns elsewhere, and demonstrated confidence in my professional judgment that had previously been undermined by chronic stress. Her observations were gratifying because they confirmed what I was beginning to feel internally, a sense that I was gradually becoming more fully myself rather than existing primarily as extension of others' needs and expectations. The positive developments in my professional and social life were complicated by ongoing distress about the children, particularly Aiden, whose age made him most aware of my absence and most capable of articulating feelings about it. Derek had begun using Aiden as intermediary, having the 9-year-old call me periodically to ask when I would visit or to express that he missed me. These calls were excruciating because Aiden's sadness was genuine even if Derek's motivation for facilitating the contact was manipulative. I struggled with how to maintain boundaries while also honoring my relationship with the child who had been central to my life for nearly a decade, and who had not chosen any of the circumstances that had led to my withdrawal. Dr. Reeves helped me develop strategies for managing these interactions in ways that honored both my boundaries and my authentic care for Aiden. She suggested that I could have direct conversations with Derek about maintaining appropriate separation between adult conflicts and children's relationships, making clear that I was willing to have limited contact with the children on terms I established, but that using them as emotional leverage was unacceptable and would result in complete cessation of contact. She also encouraged me to be honest with Aiden in age-appropriate ways about the reasons for changes in our relationship, explaining that adults sometimes need to make difficult choices about how they spend their time, and that my reduced presence was about my needs rather than about him having done anything wrong. I arranged to meet with Aiden for lunch on a Saturday afternoon, choosing a casual restaurant where we could talk without the intensity of more formal settings. He arrived with Derek, who dropped him off with instructions to call when we were finished, an arrangement that suggested Derek was attempting to demonstrate cooperation while also maintaining control over the terms of contact. Aiden looked older than when I had last seen him 3 months earlier, his features sharpening toward adolescence and his body showing the awkward growth spurts characteristic of his age. He was reserved in ways that differed from his usual exuberant greeting, watching me carefully as though uncertain how to navigate this new dynamic between us. I began by acknowledging that I knew the past months had been confusing, and that my absence from his daily life had probably felt sudden and unexplained. I told him that I loved him very much and that would never change, but that I had needed to make changes in my life that meant I could not continue being as involved in his day-to-day care as I had been previously. I explained in terms he could understand that sometimes adults realize they have been doing too much and need to make space for their own needs, and that I had been helping so much with him and his siblings and sister that I did not have time for other important parts of my own life. I emphasized that this was about what I needed rather than about anything he had done, and that I hoped we could continue to have a relationship where we saw each other occasionally even if it looked different from what we had before. Aiden listened with focused attention that suggested he was processing not just my words, but also their implications for his life. He asked directly whether I was mad at his dad, demonstrating perceptiveness about the adult conflicts underlying the changes he was experiencing. I answered honestly that I was disappointed in some of his dad's choices but that my relationship with Derek was separate from my relationship with him. I said that his dad needed to be more present and responsible as a parent, and that part of why I had stepped back was to create space for that to happen. Aiden nodded slowly, then asked the question that revealed his deepest concern: whether I still loved him and his siblings or if I had stopped caring about them. The question broke my heart because it exposed the damage that adult dysfunction inflicted on children, who had no power to control their circumstances. I told Aiden emphatically that I absolutely still loved him and always would, that my love for him was not conditional on how often we saw each other or whether I was helping with homework every night. I said that sometimes people who love each other need to have boundaries about their relationship that do not mean the love has disappeared. I acknowledged that the changes were hard and confusing, and I validated that it was okay for him to feel sad or angry about the situation. I promised that I would make effort to see him periodically if he wanted that, though it might not be as frequently as before, and that he could always reach me if he needed to talk even if we were not together physically as often. The lunch conversation provided some resolution for both of us, establishing clearer understanding of how our relationship might continue within the boundaries I had established. Aiden seemed reassured by my explicit statements of continued love and my willingness to maintain contact, even if the structure looked different. We made a plan to meet once a month for an activity of his choosing, a commitment that felt manageable within my new life while also honoring the genuine connection we shared. When Derek arrived to pick him up, Aiden hugged me with an intensity that communicated both his relief and his lingering fear that I might disappear entirely, and I left the restaurant with complex emotions about whether I was handling the situation appropriately or causing harm that I could not fully perceive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.